Dr. Sandra Paulsen, welcome to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and to meet more of my colleagues. Our topic today is NEST and the early trauma approach. So I'll be mostly talking about that. Should I mention the book first?
Yes, absolutely. I can mention it. We can see it behind you, and you can see it here. The new book is We're Listening Body, Integrating EMDR, Somatic, and Ego State Therapies. So congratulations for a new book.
Thank you. That one's interesting because it's a verbatim transcript of a 3-day intensive. There was somebody who was sitting here who was studying with me. He was here for 3 days. His job was to be the potted plant and videotape, and he transcribed it. So we've got the recording of how I actually integrated things, which is not as systematic as when I talk about NEST. So I'm going to speak about NEST as if it's possible to be entirely systematic. And of course, our clients don't cooperate with that necessarily. But NEST stands for Neuro-Effective Embodied Self-Therapy. So what does that mean? Well, neuroaffective, the N in NEST, represents all those devices and strategies that we use for self-regulation. I don't mean for ourselves, I mean for our clients' affective regulation, although we could certainly use it for ourselves if need be. Included in that are things like certainly safe state and low dose naltrexone.
So you started talking about the devices, which I remember from your training. You have your goodie bag.
Right. So things like the alpha stim, touch points that are wireless, bilateral stim, lens neurofeedback, but also resetting the affective circuits, which originally was part of the early trauma protocol, but I decoupled it because it really does stand alone. You can use it with anybody because it helps with self-regulation. It doesn't have to be with doing just early trauma work. So that's the N, and I'm giving just a gloss over so that we're just explaining the acronym first. And then the E is for embodiment through using somatic techniques, whether it's sensory motor, somatic experiencing, somatic transformation, the Hakomi method. There's various ways to get there. And I've also done a 2-day training because I think that EMDR therapists don't always need the whole enchilada for somatic training because we're already partway there. The S in NEST is for self-system enlistment through ego state therapy. And what that means is giving a voice to those disenfranchised parts of self, but also, really importantly, the rate-limiting step in therapy and in EMDR is very often loyalty to the aggressor or perpetrator introjection. So ego state therapy gives us a way to shift loyalty from the aggressor to the self. And then the T in NEST stands for two things, really. One is the 8 phases of EMDR therapy, because when we're being systematic, we can think within those 8 phases for everything I've just talked about. But also it stands for temporal integration, which is when we're targeting that which is from the first 3 years of life, trauma and neglect from the first years of life. And we're working, there's no picture memory, there may be no narrative, there's only developmental time periods, and we can target those. And I want to tip my hat to Katie O'Shea, who came up with this originally, and we collaborated for several years, and then our approaches have sort of developed differently because I've adapted it for structural dissociation and somatic dissociation. So that's what the acronym stands for.
So Sandra, your work is really different from the standard EMDR protocol because you work with these pre-verbal states, right? Before the age of 3. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. What is the difference between an explicit and implicit memory? And then how do we work with that?
Well, I'm sure that question has a scientific answer that I'm not prepared to fully give, except that explicit memory kicks in at about age 3, 4, or 5. When we think back and we can remember our first grade teacher or a 7th grade coach, that's explicit memory. We have even some sketchy narrative about what happened, maybe pictures. And when we do standard EMDR, where the assumption is that we're targeting explicit memory for the most part. And so when we say, what memory are we working with? And there's a picture, what's the worst part of it? And what's disturbing about it? All that assumes explicit memory. But nobody remembers the first 3 years of life for the most part. Every once in a while, somebody has like a dreamscape. But so the question is, how do you work with things that young? And how do you know where you are? It's like groping in a dark basement. How do you know where you are? How do you know when you're done? And so all those questions can be answered if you work systematically, developmental time period. And so we begin at or before the beginning, and we move forward in time segments, which are variable depending on the amount of trauma the person appears to have had. And there's much more to it. I've written extensively about it in this book, which some of you might be familiar with, When There Are No Words. And there's a 2-day workshop by the same title. When I do it live, it's 2 days. And then I redid it last year when I did a year-long nest training in many pieces, like one a month or so, for the Steve Frankel group. And that the early trauma protocol is in, well, at least the temporal integration part is in modules 7, 8, and 9. If you want to, you can either take the whole bundle or just parts of it. But the ways that it's different is you're targeting time periods instead of a picture memory. And you have to capture both negative and positive cognitions as they emerge during the processing, because you can't necessarily articulate them ahead of time. So I always see it like a butterfly net. These cognitions are floating around the room, and we capture them and we attend to them. The repairs have to take those negative cognitions into account, because one interesting thing working with very early trauma is, you know how babies are sort of passive? It can't be any other way until they're 15 or 20 months old, because they're so dependent on others until they start getting some agency. So when people are working in this early time period, often they're quite passive, and that spontaneous shift in where we expect people to spontaneously link into an adaptive neural net or with a simple cognitive interweave tends to not happen when you're working in these very young time periods. So we actually do the repairs are very deliberate. We take them out of what I call the bio story, that they're the way things either were or appear to have been in real life. And we pendulate over to a mythic repair, where we bring in ideal parents to make provision of what we'd wish for that client as a child, or any child, because it's always the same thing. It's care, nurturance, protection, and love, and cuddling, and positive reinforcement instead of punishment, and parents who understand developmental milestones. So mythic parents for almost everybody are almost exactly the same. But and then we go back and check the bio story for the same time period, hear something else, because there's often not just one thing for a time period. So we keep going back and checking, repairing that. We go back and check, hear something else, repair that. So it's an ongoing process. But I think the most interesting part of doing this work, the most challenging part, is that the story tells itself in a myriad of channels, some of which are familiar, like client narrative, client self-report of affect and body sensations. Maybe cognitions come to mind. But then it gets very ephemeral, because for the most part, all that is not very vivid when you're working in an implicit memory. So there may be no pictures or just dreamscapes. There may be very subtle body sensations, but they're not used to reporting it unless there's, trumpets and fanfare. So we get people attuned to just discerning real subtle nuances. But it's also therapist mirror neurons, for those of you that are familiar with that language. The therapist may pick up before the client does. In my office, I'm saying, is there something in the chest? Or what's that in the stomach? And I'm happy to be wrong. I'm always happy to be wrong. And so they usually go, oh, you're right. And then we notice that. So there's therapist mirror neurons. There's what's in the energy field, which I feel energetic holdings and releases. And some of you know what I'm talking about, and some of you think I've got two heads for saying that, but
no, I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Irene Siegel. I went to see her at the last EMDR conference, and she talks a lot about these concepts.
Good. Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with her work. Another channel that I want to mention is reenactments in the relationship field. So that, with standard protocol, if you're doing EMDR on the fiery car crash and they have PTSD, even though they might feel terror when they see the moment of right before impact, on some level, they know it's a memory. But when you're working in implicit memory, where there's no narrative and no picture, all they have is the emotion and body sensation. And it's very easy for them to project it, to think it's about the present moment. So it's very common. The client will say, oh, you think I'm stupid, don't you? I'll never get this right. And I'm saying, no, I think you're fine. But I'm wondering if feeling stupid is part of baby's story. And it almost always is. And they felt stupid, they felt ashamed, and they thought it was because they're in my presence, they thought it was about what's between us. So that's very, very common to be working with that kind of a thing. So there's a half a dozen of these channels that we put the little puzzle pieces together in a hypothesis testing way. And I always say I'm happy to be wrong, because I don't want to be leading them beyond what the data says. And the data is these little fragments. I call them dust bunnies because they're so nuanced. That's sort of a nickel version of the early trauma approach, except that a very common problem there's a couple very common problems: structural dissociation and somatic dissociation, and they require different methods. Are you trying to get a word in edgewise, Rotem, or should I?
No, I'm just enjoying talking about. I'm wondering about the difference between structural dissociation and somatic dissociation, if you could speak about that.
Structural dissociation in its more extreme forms is what we used to call multiple personality, and we've been calling it DID for a while now. And it's on a continuum, so you can have degrees of that. But anytime there's a need to do parts work, well, I should word that differently. When there's amnesia, you certainly need to do parts work to get the self system on board adequately. There are other times when you need to get the self system on board adequately too, like when there's loyalty to the aggressor. And that's certainly present in DID, but you also find it to the left on the continuum, so that your garden variety neurotic may have loyalty to the aggressor and no structural dissociation. But ego state therapy works with loyalty to the aggressor in any case. In contrast, somatic dissociation is much more about, is the person present to themselves in the present moment, in the body, in a mindful moment-to-moment way? Or did they have to clip the dashboard wires to their emotions, their needs, their body sensations early in life? Often it happens in the first year of life. So that's part of what we're hearing and repairing.
What does that mean, Sandra? Clip the dashboard wires?
Well, in the first year of life, a child may become aware that mom makes a frowny face or turns her back, or dad rages, if the child has emotions or body sensations. That is, if the child cries or needs something or squalls. And so I'm hesitating to say whether it's 6 months or 9 months, but somewhere in there, babies are beginning to discern that I mean, because they're hardwired to evoke a smile in mom 3 to 6 months. And if they get a frowny face instead, they're going to be scrambling to figure out what optimizes their chance of making mom happy. So I'm saying mom, but whoever the primary caretaker is.
Right.
And
Usually.
yeah, do what you need to do with the pronouns. But so, and in really malignant families, babies, that means structural dissociation starts very young. So, but with somatic dissociation, the reason I use the word clip the dashboard wires is because if it's not safe to have needs or feelings, and attachment being the prime directive, baby's hardwired to secure that no matter what the cost. And if the cost is jettisoning their own emotions and body sensations, then where do I sign up? And the result is somatic dissociation, intellectualization, alexithymia. Many of the personality disorders are related cousins to this. But what we see is, like, for example, take your somebody who's an intellectualizer and they don't know what you mean when you try to get them to drop into the body. The cartoon I always see is, it's a cartoon of a head, and on the left hemisphere it's like a dark cave, gray, a single light bulb, and a guy on a computer, and it's logic and verbal analysis and nothing affective there. And then on the other side of the corpus callosum, which is represented by an old-fashioned curved door, on the other side is all the colorature and attachment itself, unprocessed trauma, music, creativity, all that's on the other side. And the intellectualizer had to camp out where it's safe in the left hemisphere, and there's all that work to do over in the right hemisphere. And the question is, how do you get them there? Well, one of the best, you can do it through somatic therapy, but you can also do it through using, with most people, low-dose naltrexone. No more than 4.5 milligrams will get people more discerning about their emotions and body sensations. It's really quite remarkable. These days, because I only work in the intensive format, as part of my intake, I'm assessing to see whether they can tolerate positive and negative affect and soma. And if they can't, I urge them to get on low-dose naltrexone, so it's not like pulling hen's teeth for 3 days. Which is no fun for anybody, let me tell you.
Yeah. So Sandra, I think it's time to mention that other than, having PhD in psychology and writing these books, you also draw the cartoons for both books When There Are No Words and for the new book, We're Listening Body.
Yes. Well, and those are all 3 of the books that I've illustrated so far. The illustrations are black and white. I'm moving to color now. And Jocelyn, and I got to thank Jocelyn publicly. She urged me to open a Etsy shop, but this is one of the cartoons that I did.
Her art is amazing. This is the nest map.
Yeah, Jocelyn just posted your Etsy shop in the chat. Now I posted the PDF, the link for the PDF. Yeah.
And I've got a book that's going to be coming out first quarter of 2024, which is about high functioning autism, full color. I mean, if I can figure out how to do it, and if it doesn't cost a kidney, it's going to be full color cartoons instead of just black and white cartoons. And my more recent online workshops have included full color cartoons. So,
yeah, that's great. So, I know in your training you talked about these segments of time. You're breaking the time of the pre-verbal phase to 3 to 6 months periods. Can you talk about that, and why do we do that, and how, like, what do we do with that? With these?
Well, that's the targeting is by time segment, and we begin before the beginning, because I learned the hard way. If you begin at conception, somebody who was conceived in rape starts out on a very bad footing. So we actually begin before that based on whatever their belief system is. Doesn't matter what their belief system is, we go with their belief system. And so where were you before you were conceived? Many people will say in the universe or in God's heart or whatever they say. and we're wanting to start before anything bad happened. And so we install that as a resource before the rotten stuff started happening. And then conception's treated separately because that's about whether it was deliberate, not the gory details. We're not interested in the gory details of conception, but rather just whether they were deliberately conceived. That is, do they feel wanted or not? And what are the facts on the ground? Was dad out a submarine at the time that mom conceived, or were they on a honeymoon, or was it a date rape, or were they wanting their fourth child, or what's the deal? And then somewhere in the first trimester, a woman becomes aware she's pregnant typically, and she's either happy or not, and she either does or doesn't share it with the father, and he's either happy or not. And so we process those insights, and very often people haven't really thought of it that way. Making repairs. What would you have wished for yourself if it were entirely on your terms? And then we do the mythical repair. And we're systematically working by time frame based on what we know about developmental milestones. So it's right handy to know a little something about developmental milestones.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily
usually, all things being equal, we typically go by 3 months at a time, but that's not a cookie cutter. And if everything was just perfect in the family until both parents died in the fiery car crash at age when the patient was 2, then you might condense the time periods before that. But if you know that there was all kind, death of a twin in the 3rd trimester and a complicated birth, and then the adoption and the foster family and all that, then you're going to break it down more granularly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Sandra, how did you come up with this work? Like, how did you come up with the preverbal model? Because, EMDR, like you said, EMDR, the way we learn it initially, it's working with very explicit memory, right? Like
right.
The memory has an image, an emotion, body sensation, other senses. How did you come up with that model?
Well, I really have to credit Katie O'Shea for this, because she really is the one that, and she credits me and some other people. She credits me with the affective circuits part, but she'd been studying Phyllis Krauss and a few other people. So, but Katie O'Shea is the one that systematized it, but it was pretty complex and hard to fathom. And when she got me involved, she brought me in because she knew I was specializing in dissociation, and she wanted me to help her figure out what to do with the more complex cases. And I found I couldn't even learn it initially. And so I had to make it simpler and more clear in order to learn it. And that's how we collaborated and came up with the worksheets that then became the book, and some chapters in the book, The Neurobiology and Treatment of Traumatic Dissociation Toward an Embodied Self by Lanius, Paulsen, and Corrigan. So how did she come up with it? Trying to improve the things that standard protocol can't do. And it really does. I mean, I do nothing but now. I mean, not that I've kicked standard protocol to the curb. And one of the ways, initially, EMDR would not approve the early trauma protocol the way it was originally formulated. But when I got involved, I knew that it had to be fit into the phases of EMDR to get approval. Right. And so what we did was make very, very clear any deviation from the standard protocol and why it was necessary. And so I went over some of those. I think there are some more that I haven't mentioned, but they're more subtle than the ones. The targeting is by time period. The negative and positive cognitions have to be captured. You do the installations as you go along by time period. And there's a few others that I've really articulated in this book. And there are also worksheets at the end of this book to help guide the process. When people take the online training through the Steve Frankel group, there's no practicum for that. Now, if you take the NEST series, there's some demos, but there's no practicums. So I've started now doing practicums online for the people that took the training online but haven't had a chance to practice. So small group practicums.
Yeah, in the book that you just showed, When There Are No Words, and in your training, you give a lot of credit to Jaak Panksepp. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you learned from him and how that's related to your approach.
It's immeasurable. His contributions to the field. I think one day he'll be as important as Sigmund Freud. He's dead now, and I'm so sorry. I think of him all the time. I had the good fortune of knowing him, and I wouldn't call him a collaborator because he's a brilliant neuroscientist and I'm a cartooning psychologist, but he was up in Seattle where I live. I'm out on an island near Seattle for cancer treatment one summer in 2009, and I spent quite a bit of time with him and his wife because we're so close geographically here. And I had been, well, the first day I met him, I drew a cartoon of what I understood of his model because I'd already read his work, and we were writing The Embodied Self, the neurobiology book at that time, and my colleagues referred to him as the great man, and they're neurobiology freaks. And the thing is, he experimentally proved that we mammals have hardwired subcortical affective circuits that are present from birth and require no learning. And then our object relations learning in the attachment period is superimposed on top of that. The learning starts happening on top of that substrate. So the resetting the affective circuits is resetting the circuits that Jaak Panksepp proved exist. And plus shame. He didn't find shame in rats, but they're shameless, so we're not surprised by that. Yeah, right. This is my security team right here.
That's the best security team.
So I think about Jaak all the time, and in fact, there's a cartoon on the Etsy shop that shows it's an updated version of the Panksepp cartoon, because the first day I met him, I was drawing what I understood his theory to be, and I got it on one page, which he loved. And he said, I can't do an Estonian accent, but he said, you've got the amygdala a little too high. And he wanted me to redraw it for his book, Archaeology of Mind. And it's in his book, but the publisher made him do a hideous, boring version of it, not a cartoon. But we went through 12 versions of the cartoon until he was happy with it. And then it went in his book. And then I updated it this year, and the updated one is for sale on Etsy. It includes not just what Jaak had, that the affective circuits are integrated at the periaqueductal gray, but my brilliant colleagues tell me that body sensations integrated right next door to the periaqueductal gray at the superior colliculus, and they assure me that Jaak would agree with that statement. So I updated the cartoon to include the integration, not just of affect, but sensory sensation as well.
Yeah. So Sandra, I feel like I can talk to you for hours and hours and hours. This is so interesting. Your work is so interesting. I want to thank you for being a guest on the Art and Science of EMDR.
My pleasure.
Thank you.